Hello, everyone. Welcome to the ARCS webinar, Conservation Red Flags, Warning Signs for Your Collection. It's 12 noon Eastern Standard Time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Robin Bauer-Kilgo, and I'm the Communications and Member Services Manager for the Association of Registrars and Collection Specialists. To get started, we had a few announcements or just kind of reminders to give. Our conference is coming up November 7th to 9th in 2019 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I would urge that if you have not already registered, please do so. We are filling up. This looks to be the biggest biggest conference that we've had so far. The hotel rooms are going, space is filling up, so if you haven't, please do so. Preliminary schedule will be available in August 2019. Our stipend awardees will be notified in August 2019 as well, and we will be having a conference app again this year. It's going to be available via Apple and Google Play in September of 2019. That hyperlink down at the bottom is where you can find out all the fun information about our 2019 conference. A couple general rules for today's webinar. All of our attendees are in listen-only mode, so your mics are going to be muted. There will be a Q&A period at the end of the webinar, so feel free to post questions during the talk, and we'll be monitoring the box during the event. So if you have a question in the middle, feel free to post it. We will keep an eye on it. This session will also be recorded and posted to our website, arcsinfo.org, in the coming week. We have 3 speakers today, which we're really looking forward to hearing from. Our first speaker is actually going to be a recording from Jennifer Waxman, who's the Archives Manager at the National World War II Museum. Our second speaker is Jason Wyatt, Collections Manager at the James Museum of Western and Wildlife Art. And our final speaker is Heather Becker, CEO of the Conservation Center. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand the mic over to Travis Putterbaugh up in St. Augustine to introduce our speakers.
Good afternoon. My name is Travis Putterbaugh. I'm the curator of the World Golf Hall of Fame and Museum in St. Augustine, Florida. On behalf of ARCS, I'd like to thank you for joining today's webinar. Our first presenter is Jennifer Waxman, an archives and collections consultant and the former archives manager at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans.
Hello, my name is Jennifer Waxman, Archives Manager at the National World War II Museum. Today I'm going to talk to you about preservation concerns for book and paper collections and thinking through specialized housing when you have access to a conservator and when you don't. Now, our setup at the museum here, we do not have a conservator, we do not have a conservation lab, we do not do any intervention in our collections. We do preservation, specialized housing. We have a setup where we can create custom housing in-house for collections. Our first collection we're going to talk about is a collection of 275 8x10 black and white developed out prints from 1945. Fortunately, all of these photographs are stable and consistent in size, so finding a storage solution should be fairly straightforward. You can see on the left image, the photographs are individually sleeved and stored in a typical flip-top barrier board archival box. For most photograph collections, this would be an appropriate storage solution, but for this collection, the curling of the paper layer combined with the quantity of photographs and weight of each sleeve makes a box and folder storage solution vertical box and storage solution not the best for long-term care of this collection. You can see in the center image the significant curl of the stack of photographs. In this case, storing them vertically encourages the photographs to continue to curl. There's just not enough support provided by the sleeves and folders to hold these photos upright. Also, the folders are overstuffed, providing even more weight for in each folder. We could send these photos to conservation for humidification and flattening. Prints require professional intervention for humidification. But we would still have to come up with a better enclosure for the long-term storage. The paper they are printed on is thick and strong. The images I'm showing you on this slide don't look that offensive, but I assure you these are very determined photographs. You can see how far past the edge of the box the photographs rest. There are voids that the curling creates inside of the box, and the damage that they are doing to the folders as well. Whether you humidify and flatten them or not, the weight and quantity of these photographs require them to be stored horizontally, with an indication on the box about keeping these photos stored flat. Without sending these photographs to conservation, we came up with a way to store them that would eventually, over time, help them relax and keep them better preserved over the long term. The solution we came up with was to provide a custom corrugated box with 4 flap folders. By splitting the photos into smaller stacks and providing a rigid support structure with both the 4 flap and the corrugated board box, these photos will slowly and eventually flatten. Again, they certainly could have been sent to conservation, but this shows you how custom housing can help you out if you do not have access to a conservator. You can also see the labeling on the box indicates that these collections should continue to be stored flat. Now I'm going to talk about scrapbooks. Scrapbooks are notoriously challenging because they come with a lot of unpredictable issues and usually contain unstable elements. Scrapbooks require a lot of compromise to properly care for them. This scrapbook has stable cover boards, but that is just about the only stable thing about it. You can see several of the pages have been torn along the perforations, and the text block itself has aged and detached from the spine. The photographs are attached to each page with photo corners, as well as acidic pressure-sensitive adhesive, also known as tape. This tape is very sticky, and you can see the interleaving between each page, an initial attempt at triage for the scrapbook. Even though a stopgap measure, this interleaving inadequately protects each page and adds bulk to the width of the volume. In this slide, you can see how the pressure-sensitive adhesive is destroying the image layer of photographs on adjacent pages. The outset on the left and the outset on the right have the same damage pattern. You can see it in this red circles, also across the top of the photos with the red arrows. So what then do you do with a scrapbook who is essentially damaging itself in the natural state that it lives in? Do you remove every page? Do you remove all of the tape? This would require a professional conservator to lift tape and to intervene at such a high level. Also, removing elements of a scrapbook destroys its integrity. A scrapbook itself is made up of several different pieces, and together it creates one item. So disassembling or removing elements, all of this requires careful planning consideration when you think about long-term preservation. Ultimately, we decided to disbind and separately sleeve each leaf in custom-cut polyethylene sleeves. The trade-off is that this is a time-consuming project, but worth it in the end for both preservation and access. Disbinding required careful separation of the leaves that were glued to the spine along their perforated edge. Since several pages had already been removed, we continued along this route and stored the cover board separately from the leaves. And you can see we created 4 flap folders and custom cut corrugated clamshell board boxes for all of the pages of the scrapbook. Removing each page from the spine must be done by someone with the appropriate hand skills and training. You can send this to a conservator, but if someone on staff also has appropriate paper handling skills, they could easily and carefully remove the pages from the cover boards. The next subject I want to talk about is a scrolled document. Scrolled documents cannot be viewed in their entirety without careful handling. Coming up with a solution for access requires conversations with a conservator. This item, as you can see, was also damaged at the top edge. Tear repairs were required and replacement of the loss that it occurred over time from its handling. The access solution required acrylic rods attached with Japanese tissue on each edge in order to move the object in a scrolling fashion. This was the solution the conservator came up with. Now combine this with the custom housing that we created for careful access, and you have long-term preservation for access. In this slide, you can see the genius housing that was created to accommodate this document that had been mounted on the acrylic rods and required access as a scroll. The outside of the box was labeled with indication that the lid is removable, it's not a clamshell, that it should be handled with care, and that it should be stored flat. The interior of the lid, there are instructions on how to remove the scroll from the box and use the contraption itself. We also created a video in order to demonstrate how to use the box and access the document itself. And here we will watch it.
So now we're going to go ahead and listen to our next presenter. I'm going to hand the mic back over to Travis so he can introduce Jason Wyatt.
Thank you, Jennifer. Our next presenter is Jason Wyatt, Collections Manager at the James Museum of Western and Wildlife Art in St. Petersburg, Florida.
Hi, this is Jason Wyatt. Currently, I'm the Collections Manager at the James Museum of Western and Wildlife Art in St. Petersburg, Florida, as Travis said. But from 1997 to about 2017, I worked in the Newark Museum in Newark, New Jersey, where I worked my way up from an intern to become the collections manager. During my time there, I got to see a change in museums from institutions that didn't take into account collection staff's input when it came to the decision whether something should or could be brought into the collection, to our input being valuable in that type of decision. I'm presenting 4 different types of objects from my time in Newark, each with their own set of conservation issues, and how myself, the registrars, and conservators have dealt with them over the years. In 2002, the Newark Museum got the chance to purchase about 150 Tibetan rugs, seat covers, and horse trappings. At this time, the collections division was not brought in on the discussion as to whether the museum had the space or resources to accommodate a collection of this size. Once the purchase was complete, it became our responsibility to find the space and properly store each item. We tried to find space in our textile storage room to accommodate the collection, but couldn't figure out how to rework the space. The decision was made to give up part of the main hallway, originally used to store crates, to be dedicated storage for the rug collection. We were tasked with completing this project on a very tight budget. The rugs were put into isolation, frozen, and thoroughly vacuumed. A simple wall unit, as you see here, was purchased and put into the hallway. We also put in an existing flat file system that wasn't being used in the hallway. We worked with the textile conservator to figure out the best plan to store the rolled rugs. The big problem was the amount of foot traffic in the main hallway that could bring in unwanted pests. We didn't want to seal the rugs in plastic because of the possibility of the creation of microclimates, so we used Tyvek, a breathable polyethylene material. The rugs were laid on the Tyvek, and the edges of the Tyvek were folded over the sides of the rug, and then they were rolled on archival tubes. The hope was this method would create a barrier for any pests. The system was successful until about 2014 or 15, when we started to notice the presence of moths in the main hallway that was most likely brought in by people coming and going. The collection staff had increased, and more people had access to this area, from staff members in other departments to outside vendors used for photography, shipping, and crating. The rugs were spot checked for moth activity, but no damage was noted. Pheromone-based moth traps were used, and this seemed to do the trick until early 2017, when an upswing in moths became noticeable. We began to spot check rugs again, and to our horror, we found a full-scale infestation had occurred without us noticing. It was a surprise because moths had not been seen in close to 2 years. As we opened each rolled rug, some were affected while others had minor damage, and then few were actually completely destroyed. On a side note, nothing in the flat storages were affected by the moths. So clicking through the slides, you can see some of the damage that has occurred. Parts of it were completely eaten away. You can see the frass from the moths. There's a live moth larva. So the rugs were, as we found this out, the rugs were completely sealed in plastic bags as they were unrolled and again put into isolation to be evaluated. This time we had our objects conservator guide us in the handling of the situation. Every rug was frozen twice, 24 hours in the freezer, 24 hours out of the freezer, and back in for another 24 hours. Each bagged rug was inspected, and if there were signs of moth life, they were frozen again. Once it was determined that there were no more live moths, every rug was vacuumed front and back and then sealed in plastic. We used rolled plastic sheet tubing that was cut to accommodate the lengths, as you can see here, and sealed using a crimped heating device. An empty room was used to store the now sealed rugs so that they were isolated from the rest of the collection and could be regularly monitored. The rugs were stored flat on metro shelving. A few months before I left, we decided to apply for a grant to help realize a new storage vision that was developed to better store the rugs back in the main hallway because that was the only space that we had. We wanted powder-coated steel cabinets with glass doors made to house the rolled rugs. The rugs would be rolled without any barrier, Tyvek, or paper so that when we looked through the glass windows, we'd be able to see the rugs, no problem. All new archival tubes would have to be purchased since we ended up throwing out the old tubes because of the infestation. We never did get the grant, but I understand from my friends that are still working there, other sources of money are being looked at in order to complete this project. Currently, the rugs are still sealed in plastic, stored flat, and regularly monitored by the current collections manager. So here you see a 5th century Coptic fish jug that was purchased in 1929. It had been on view in our former classical galleries beginning in 2013 as part of a permanent exhibition devoted to ancient Coptic Egypt. Sorry for the bad slide, but this is the only one I could find that showed what we discovered in 2014, the debris that had been collecting around the base. Our objects conservator was brought in to evaluate the piece to determine the actual cause. The conservator noted the surface of the piece looked crystalline and hazy, and the silver nitrate test showed there were chloride salts present. The expansion and contraction of the salts due to the moisture in the air caused small amounts of the surface to pop off, which was the debris around the base. As you can see, the surface is very pitted and a lot of the slip coating is missing or hazy, all due to salts. A conservation plan was created in 2015 and implemented. The jug needed to be soaked in distilled water, but before this could happen, the remaining slip layer needed to be stabilized. 5 applications of hydroxypropyl cellulose, a thermoplastic polymer, was misted onto the surface to consolidate the slip layer. Once this process was complete, the jug was soaked in distilled water that had been further filtered through an iCrystalab Demanic A6 filtration system. The piece was soaked 5 times in successful baths until the water was no longer tested positive for salts. Finally, the jug was slowly dried on cotton blotters to reach the relative humidity and ambient conditions. The next few slides show the before and after images taken by the conservator. As you can see in the before images, the surface looked very hazy and extensively pocked. On a side note, nobody ever realized that the surface was not what it was supposed to look like because the first image that you saw was our professional photograph that we used for promotional materials. But here you can see after treatment, and then I have side by side before and after treatments. And again, before after, you can start seeing more of the slip here and then side by side. And again, just to give you an idea of befores and afters. All right, next. This is a group of jewelry design drawings created by the Richardson Manufacturing Company in Newark, New Jersey. The company was in business from the early 1930s to about 1950. The drawings were done on celluloid using some sort of colored pencils. Celluloid is a material made from nitrocellulose and camphor, which is highly flammable. Over time, celluloid can deteriorate in specific ways. One way is when the nitrocellulose pushes the camphor to the surface, where it evaporates, leaving behind an extremely brittle plastic. Excess moisture can also cause the nitrocellulose to break down. Celluloid can also absorb ultraviolet light, which can make the material stiff and breakable. And as you can see from these pictures, any one of these examples probably is causing what you're seeing. So these are going to be detailed shots of the pieces showing how they were buckled, cracked, and lost segments over time. Although not visible in the images, when they came in, the pieces looked wet on the surface and had a very strong odor. So here you can see some of that buckling. More buckling and cracking. And again, I just want to say one more thing about the drawings. They were gifted to the museum in 2009, as you see them. The curator at the time felt that they were important historical records of a small but historically significant jewelry company that had gone out of business decades before. Because of the unstable nature of the material and the fact that they were already breaking down, the collections department needed to figure out how to best deal with them. The pieces were permanently accessioned into the collection with the full knowledge that they were not going to stay in the museum. It was decided that each drawing would be extensively photographed, documented, and added to the database. Once all of this was complete, the original drawings were disposed of by bringing them to a place so they could be incinerated. We decided that the pieces were meant to live on as a visual document, not physical ones, because of the harm to other objects that could come by these pieces being kept in storage. Finally, I want to talk about a contemporary piece of artwork that's called Wang Jin. It's by Wang Jin, called Dream of China. It's created in 2005. In 2007, the Asian department purchased Wang Jin's Dream of China, created in 2005. The piece is made from thick polyvinyl sheeting embroidered with monofilament. Because of the problematic nature of the materials, a conservator was brought in to evaluate the piece and give a recommendation on how to properly store the piece, if and when it was purchased. According to the 2007 conservation report, polyvinyl chloride, PVC, is comprised of the monomer unit of vinyl chloride and up to 50% plasticizer materials, mostly a mixture of a variety of dialkyl phthalates. PVC is considered inherently unstable and can be problematic to collections by providing acidic, corrosive materials in the aging of the PVC. The breakdown of the PVC occurs over time and is increased with light, heat, and oxygen, and acidic hydrogen chloride gas can be given off. The acids can be corrosive to other artifacts. In addition, plasticizers can migrate out of the PVC and form a sticky residue on the surface and cause embrittling of the PVC sheet. The plasticizers have also been known to be corrosive to artifacts. Once the surface of the artifact becomes sticky, it attracts dust and dirt readily and is very difficult to clean. The main concern with having the piece in the collection was its storage and the possible effects on the surrounding collection materials. At a very minimum, the collections department wanted a storage crate built so that it could be separated from anything it would be stored near. Because of the cost of building this crate, it took a few years to actually have the crate built. The piece was sealed in the crate until sometime around 2015 when it was put on display in an exhibition. When we opened the crate, a strong distinctive odor was very noticeable, and there was a hazy coating over the entire surface, both inside and out. The piece was wiped down with soft cotton cloths, both inside and out, before it was put on display. This problem, coupled with the strong smell that didn't seem to dissipate, made the collections department wonder what the next step would be once the piece came off of display. The original conservation report in 2017 was looked at again. This paragraph was used as the basis of the new plan. And that said, in order to reduce the breakdown of PVC components as well as their corrosive effects on other museum collections, several mitigation processes have been tried with some success. The introduction of ageless and iron oxide-based oxygen scavenger had been used to reduce oxygen, thereby slowing aging and releasing release of corrosive fumes. Activated carbon has been used to absorb harmful off-gassed components, and zeolites of sodium aluminosilicate have been shown to reduce the rate of deterioration of PVC. So we decided that the original crate needed to be retrofitted to accommodate some of the above mentioned materials. After a lot of calculations, the proper amounts of ageless and iron oxide-based oxygen scaver, ARCS, which are silica gel sheets, and pure carb, a pollutant scavenger used to control off-gassing, was determined that needed to be added to the crate. As you can see by these images, there needed to be a lot of this material to keep, but also there needed to be room to store the actual piece. Once the piece was removed from view, it was put in a new retrofitted crate and put into storage where it still sits today. It's important to note that according to Yvonne Shashua in her article, Inhibiting the Deterioration of Polyvinyl Chloride, a Museum Perspective, PVC has a useful lifetime of 10 to 35 years. Dream of China is already 14 years old. It makes one wonder how much longer this piece will last. Finally, I would like to end by saying, as collections managers and registrars, it's not for us to determine what belongs in a museum. That decision should be left to the curatorial staff. We are there to give as much information on how a piece should be stored. Conservation needs both immediate and through the years, and if possible, the costs associated with having an object in the collection. All this information can be used to help curators, directors, and boards of trustees make an informed decision. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. So now we're going to go ahead and hand over the presenter to Heather Becker. And Travis, if you want to go ahead and introduce her, that'd be great.
Thank you, Jason. Our final presenter today is Heather Becker, the CEO of the Conservation Center in Chicago.
Hello, everyone. This is Heather. And Travis, thank you for the introduction. My presentation today is Lessons Learned, Minimizing Damage Through Preparation and Conservation. And we're going to be talking a lot about disaster planning as well as disaster response. So we've learned over the last 35 years of visiting hundreds of disaster sites that it is extremely important to understand preparation and the importance of it, not only mentally, but operationally. And then the outcome is usually much better. So some of the key points that are going to be woven into the presentation are things that we have observed over visiting several disaster sites, and we're going to give many examples. And of course, all of those cases are very different. We're also going to be talking about risk management and some of the things that you could be doing to offer prevention, and also some best practices for potential best outcomes. We're also going to be talking about the importance of training and communication and doing drills and various things that can help expedite methods as well as best response. And then lastly, how innovation is affecting disaster response in correlation to the ability of timing, triage, as well as conservation treatment itself. So this is just a handful of various large cat disasters that we have assisted with, and I have to say all of them are extremely different. The first being one at a bank in Chicago that had over 2,000 photographs scattered throughout the building with a very severe fire. and then more recently assisting with a lot of the wildfires and mudslides in California. But I did want to touch upon one that we recently were involved with, which was an institution with a large collection of over 2,000 items that had not really ever prepared for a tornado. And of course, tornadoes are happening more often in areas where they didn't used to happen. And it took the roof off the building and exposed the collection. And in addition to that, rain immediately began, and the pack out was so much more difficult and complex than they had ever anticipated. So this was a great example where they had had a disaster plan, thought through several things, but never thought through this kind of a case scenario. So what are the common risk management tools that we think might be helpful and constructive to you? Obviously, some of these are very common sense things, but we like to reiterate them because you'd be surprised when disasters occur how a lot of these things maybe have not even been addressed. The first being climate controls and constantly monitoring temperature and humidity of the collection and what might be causing accelerated deterioration in correlation to that. And of course, walking through the collection and looking at the condition. A lot of people are used to really enjoying the aesthetics of the collection and appreciating it from a visual and historical context, but they're not necessarily looking at it regularly for condition changes. And I encourage everybody to try to get a different set of eyes looking at the collection to see those slow and yet very methodical things that are changing over time. It's also very common to have discussions about UV exposures, updating glazing and window films. Also pest monitoring. Even though it doesn't happen very often, we have found, as it was just discussed, things that happen can become incredibly invasive very fast and cause severe deterioration. A few of the next two things here when it comes to archival materials, framing materials, and reversible hinging, and all of those mechanisms inside of a framing package. Once again, this is something that is seen by conservators over and over, and these very important yet subtle mistakes can cause deterioration to the collection before a disaster even happens. And then we also, it's not thought of very often, but the hanging hardware, which rusts and deteriorates and becomes weaker over time and could cause a risk management situation. And something we saw over and over following Hurricane Katrina as well as Hurricane Sandy in New York City is monitoring everything in storage, whether it's in an art storage warehouse, your own facility, storage building, and of course the exposures in a basement, which are important, and of course first floor exposures, which are common sense. So looking at what our common obstacles are in correlation to disaster response, and the most important is having a disaster plan that is comprehensive and that evolves over the years. Even if you write a disaster plan, how often are you opening it up, updating it, making modifications, looking at how it currently reflects the institution and the collection? Updating appraisals and values and how that changes based on the market, and understanding that that also affects your policy considerations. The thing that we have noticed on most disaster sites is the lack of an updated inventory. And it's not just the inventory, whether it's accessioning or deaccessioning, but it's also updating the room by room inventory, because you may have your inventory established in a different format, but when it comes to disaster response, you want to have it also formatted room by room, because that is usually how a site scope done is done in order to decide how a pack out and how the disaster response moves forward in a methodical and well-planned manner. Also, looking at whether you may be underinsured if the appraisals and values have not been assessed recently. And discussing the policy with your broker on a regular basis and understanding how not only the insurance industry is changing and how that might change your policy considerations, as well as getting feedback from the brokers on what you may not be thinking of from their perspective. And then lastly, looking at how whether you're loaning things to other institutions or other collections and things are coming in and out, and how all of those other parties involved might add to a very complex claim scenario if something were to happen. So what are some of the lessons learned? And it's all correlated to planning and execution of that plan. So establishing that disaster plan and really having training sessions and drills with the team and the team members that would be considered in advance of anything ever happening. I also mentioned the offsite inventory and understanding that it's not just important to have a recent updated inventory within the facility, but also having offsite documentation as well. The photographic documentation, as well as the appraisal and any other important provenance information that is going to affect not only the adjusting in the claim process, but also determining the priority removal plan. And a lot of people say, well, what is a priority removal plan? It's really looking at what are the things that are the rarest items in the collection, the most important, maybe even sentimental, or the most valuable works, and making sure that you're considering that removal plan based on those priorities. So we talk here about the human factor related to all of this, and really thinking about the fact that if you have not done this planning in these drills and thinking these things through in advance, the results are usually much worse. And most people obviously think this is never going to happen to them, and sure enough, it does. And with what's happening with the world and climate change, a lot of these disasters are becoming, unfortunately, more common for all of us. So what does that mean as far as how we handle these situations from a personal level? We have gone into so many sites where there's been a major loss, a major devastation to not only the institution and the collection, but people's families and their own homes. So there's this added level of stress in how they handle their response to the situation. So thinking that through mentally for yourself in advance, what would you do if this collection was exposed to a major mold situation or a major fire or a hurricane or a tornado? And obviously, once you've put yourself into that mental state in advance, it allows you to then step into the situation a bit calmer and making healthier decisions when you are confronted with a very, very uncomfortable situation. And obviously, safety in the environment is something that is very important to all of this. If there's been a major fire or a very, very considerable mold exposure, I think people get so excited and the energy is so high in that disaster response process, they really sometimes forget about the safety element. For example, we witnessed several people after Hurricane Sandy walking directly into dirty water, which is a very major health concern, without even considering that to go in and save the art. So lastly, having relationships in advance that you know once you're in a terrible situation, you're going to be able to trust those folks to come in and assist you on all types of levels. So here, this is a tremendous amount of information I'm throwing at you on this slide, and it is the basic core of a disaster plan. I'm going to be focusing on the right column, the items in turquoise first, since there's too much to cover here in one session. So first is mentioning that human factor, the human resources in the training. So having a phone tree established with a hierarchy of the potential team members. What are those team members' strengths? And which part of the process of disaster response should they be assisting with? What areas of the collection are they most knowledgeable about? And what are their strengths and potential weaknesses as part of a team in the disaster response process? Then evacuation and pack-out protocols. I think a lot of people think through what a typical pack-out would be, but they don't think about what it would be like when there's heavy soot in the air and it's hard to even breathe without wearing a smoke-based respirator. Or you're going into a collection that is completely heavily mold exposed and Tyvek suits and masks are required, and having to do that type of a pack-out and stay calm and make those decisions based on all of those environmental and safety issues. And what does that mean for the insurance coverages during that pack out and evacuation process, and the risk exposures that are going to be happening during that pivotal moment of the pack out and evacuation. So we highly recommend doing training drills related to all of this so people become used to what they're going to be confronted with in these kinds of situations. So who are those contacts? Let's say you've done your due diligence and you have vetted various service providers that you are going to be needing to help you in this situation. So having that information off-site and having all of those contacts and phone numbers and such. And that includes your broker and insurance contacts, vetted art handlers who are trained professionals that have access to air ride, temperature controlled vehicles and all of the proper materials. And we have found after major cat disasters, all of these materials and trucks and various suppliers get evaporated very, very quickly, as well as relationships with the conservators as it correlates to the mediums and the types of works in the collection, and knowing what your needs are related to conservation experts. And lastly, building remediation companies. There are a tremendous amount of providers out there. It is a fast-changing industry, and you really want to vet those folks in advance and make sure that you have them on retainer or have those relationships established in advance, because once again, they are going to be all on high alert and very, very busy once a catastrophe has occurred. So offsite backups is the last section I'm going to be mentioning. We've already talked about inventory and priority removal plan and all this documentation, and having that not only in the institution or in the building where the collection is housed, but also having all of this established in one or two additional offsite locations and backups, and making sure that that material has been updated recently as well. So as we now shift into prevention and risk management, now we're shifting into what it looks like in the disaster response steps, and what do those actions look like. And of course, if you have done all of this training and all of this planning and constantly updating that, you are going to have a much more effective and timely response. You're going to have the proper team members based on the collection, and you're also going to have thought through all of the different case scenarios that you might be confronted with. One other thing that happens pretty often after a major disaster is you've done all this planning and everybody's ready to go, and then you may not have full access to the building because of safety and environmental issues. And then once you move into the safety and environmental concerns, talking about what are those safe triage protocols related to health, awareness, and of course, what are the materials that are going to be required? Special masks, maybe even Tyvek suits, and what are those safety and precaution things related to the scale of the exposed collection? You know, is it 10 items of major concern, or is it an entire collection of maybe 3,000 items? And that, of course, correlates to the walkthrough and making scope decisions. We oftentimes have found that if you go into the site after getting full and safety access, going to the core of where the disaster has occurred, especially in the case of example of a fire, and really going from the inside of the major loss to the outside perimeters in determining where you need to start operating first in order to have the best triage and evacuation protocols put in place quickly. And then, of course, all of that in situ on-site documentation right on the site location is instrumental in the rest of the claim process. So let's say you're now moving into that phase of the walkthrough, and you have your experts working with you, and of course at that point determining what really should be considered a total loss, such as this piece here, versus focusing your energy on the other items that could be immediately triaged. So in the middle of this, all of this is a calm and practical and very efficient inventory. And sometimes that is very hard to do when you're working inside of a completely soot damaged property. Where do you do that inventory? How do you facilitate it? Thinking through a clean room and setting up a place where this kind of effective and efficient work can be done properly. so that the inventory is done without making mistakes in this kind of a stressful situation. So triage, there's so many different types of triage potentials. Here's an example of an old master's painting on panel, and it has been severely affected by water damage. There is lifting and cockling areas of pigment and tented areas. So the conservator thought the immediate Japanese tissue facing would be the most safe and careful way of holding the current status of the work, carefully packing it out and transporting it and getting it to a conservation laboratory safely without any additional damage occurring. So I'm not going to be able to go into all of these triage examples, but there's lots of things that are available during this phase of the entire process. So now I'm going to show you a triage example. So this was a major loss, a collection with around 1,400 works. About 4 feet of water from a hurricane rushed into the facility. Very few things were able to be put above water in time. So a lot of this material was submerged. Everybody walked in after the water was extracted, thinking the entire collection was a loss. It was carefully packed out and kept wet and gotten to the laboratory in order to do water washing triage to all 1,400 works within 24 hours. And then they started going through the next 24 hours of the drying phase. I have to say only 50 works in this entire collection were losses because this triage and the pack out and evacuation was done so carefully and methodically. So the results were amazing. So let's say now you're through the triage phase and you're moving into the collection has now been affected. It's at a laboratory and conservators are assessing the collection. And so now their process is slowing down a little bit and getting a bit more methodical and obviously maybe not as stressful either. So you're having the conservators identify the condition of the works, thinking through what is related to the claim situation versus what might be correlated to inherent vice, age-related damage, and possibly previous conservation repairs. So here is a book paper example. This was at an institution that had water and mold exposure. This was one of their most important works in the collection. It was shipped to our laboratory in the wet, frozen state. It is a 10th century Greek codex, and of course it was in terrible shape at this point. It had to be debound, and every page, which was vellum, had to be water washed and then slowly and carefully treated over the next couple of months. Each page had to be stretched in a very slow, careful drying process, and then it was rebound and a new clamshell box was created for it in order to minimize risk exposure with fire, water, or particulates into the future. But the outcome was very, very promising considering how damaged it was. Here's another example. We mentioned earlier preventative issues correlated to archival materials. Well, if you haven't opened up many of the works in your collection in some time to really find these old non-archival materials, when a disaster occurs, it's going to be exacerbated even further. So here is an example of a Modigliani that was framed very poorly and hinged with all of this very aggressive adhesive material. It also caused edge discoloration where the hinges originally were. So it was all done, it was redone using all archival materials, and this is a close-up example of reframing using UV plexi, the acid-free matting and spacer, the work of art, the proper non-acidic backing boards, and then of course a conservation seal around the perimeter of the entire package before it is dropped into the frame and sealed. Excuse me. So here you see the Modigliani after treatment. You also see the new hanging hardware and all of the encapsulated provenance and documentation on the verso. We also like to mention the fact of the VERA laws, the Visual Artists' Rights Act of 1990, and thinking about that, how it came into effect, especially after Hurricane Sandy, and all of those living artists and the collections that were affected, and the fact that conservators should really be dialoguing with the artists and their studios or their foundations in order to make the healthiest conservation decisions and making sure that the artist's rights are being considered in this entire process. The other thing is thinking through how innovation is changing the industry of conservation. Here's a great example of a gale vase, which was severely damaged in a catastrophe. There is a new product called Hextol, which has a similar refractive index to glass. So the results of glass conservation have changed considerably over the last 5 years. So this is just one of the many examples of how conservation is growing and changing based on innovation and technology. So using that technology after a disaster has occurred, and whether it's UV analysis or black light analysis or microscopic analysis, and here's an example of a very, very soot-covered painting. And that was very, very helpful using that technology in the process. So here you see the before of the heavily soot fire damaged work on the left, and this was a very large piece, about 14 feet by 12 feet, and you see the middle of the treatment process just exposing that beautiful palette underneath all of the soot. So one of the last things I want to mention to you is the importance of best practices related to transportation and packing. You know, you can have all of these incredible relationships and support and conservation, but if you're not following best practices correlated to due diligence and who these art handlers and packers are, it could be detrimental to this entire process. So not only the pack out, but also the return after everything has been hopefully fixed and recovered from a disaster, making sure that you're using air ride, temperature controlled vehicles, and making sure that those people involved have been background checked as well. So documentation is an instrumental part of this entire process, whether it's on-site to a disaster, the evacuation process, the conservation process, and of course, hopefully the positive outcomes following conservation. And making sure that all of the records, all of the provenance and documentation has been retained, not only for the value, but the historical context of the work. And then lastly here, I'm wrapping up my thoughts just to say that obviously this is a very daunting task when you're confronted with a devastating situation, but really thinking through who those relationships are in advance, building a team that you can trust, and making sure that you're mentally prepared for any type of situation. And of course, thinking through all of that is what I'm here to impart with you today. So at this point, I am going to close and we are going to open it up to our question and answer period. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Heather. That was a great presentation. Both of our presenters, our live ones and our recorded ones, were excellent today. So we are going to go ahead and open up the field for, excuse me, I'm switching over my screen right now. We're going to go ahead and open up everything for a Q&A period. Feel free to put things in the chat box if you'd like to. I will also add that Heather was nice enough to give us a handout, which should also be available to everyone, kind of covering over her entire presentation. So while we're waiting, if Travis, if you want to go ahead and pop on here as well, that would be wonderful.
Hi, thank you, and thank you to all of our presenters for excellent material today. I hope everybody enjoyed it and took away some great information.
So it looks like one of our first questions is to Jason, and actually all of our speakers can go ahead and unmute their mic if they'd like. Question for Jason was the planned disposition of the celluloid drawings documented at the time of acquisition? Have you done this with other plastic collections? And if so, is this procedure outlined in your collections policy? So Jason, if you could give us a quick answer to that question.
So this is the first time we had experienced anything like this at the time. We, as the collections department, were very hesitant about doing something like this because of the view that it was dangerous. So the decision was made that yes, we were going to accession into the collection, but it was only going to be a visual document, and everyone was okay with us disposing of the pieces because they really, as you can see, they really just weren't very useful physically. I mean, what were we going to do with them? So the decision to get rid of them was far outweighed the possibility of keeping them. So is it in our collections policy? I guess based around deaccessioning, you could make a statement for a case for it, but we do have a deaccession policy at Newark. And honestly, the curator was totally fine with us getting rid of them also. He just wanted a visual record of the pieces. So.
Excellent, thank you. And now we have another question from one of our attendees. They're asking, would it be wise to add a line item in the collections budget for general emergencies? And I would say yes, but I'd like to hear what our speakers have to say as well.
Oh, absolutely. You know, really understanding and when you're doing those drills and training sessions, there might be certain things that you might want to have at your ready in advance, and having a budget for that is definitely something I would suggest. Absolutely.
I definitely agree. Living in a state with hurricanes, you know, we know that we're susceptible to that. So yes, we do have money for situations like that here.
Yeah, I know. I'm in Florida as well, and we're all watching that wackadoodle wave kind of going to Texas and Louisiana right now, and we're all kind of like, that's too early, like for this to be happening. So yeah, I think I do emergency stuff as well, and I really think having that, if you can get that line item in your budget, that's nice because it's like a pocket of money you can kind of depend on for sure.
Yeah.
For Heather, do you have any suggestions on how to accomplish updated appraisals / values or funding?
Well, obviously, having relationships with appraisers is a very instrumental part of this entire process. They play such a pivotal role in our industry, and also recognizing the fact that the art industry is constantly changing and values are constantly being modified. So definitely really looking at who are the experts in your region, having relationships with them in advance, and consulting with them on a regular basis, because they may have new suggested recommendations for you related to certain parts of the collection versus other parts of the collection. So I do think that those relationships, not just with conservators and art handlers and all these outside providers, appraisers are instrumental in this entire process as well.
Great, thank you. And a final question coming in, it says, for small museums / historic sites that may not have any conservation staff or are volunteer staffed, are there any resources available for best practices in disaster preparedness in handling different materials such as books, works on art, photographs, furniture, metal objects? For example, you kept mentioning keep water damaged materials wet. So what kind of sources do you both know about that smaller institutions could possibly use as resources?
Well, I think finding people that consult in this area, obviously this is something we do a lot of, and we even sometimes work with people to outline those disaster plans and think through what their particular case scenarios are based on their collection as well as their site location, whether it's by state or region of exposures. But really, there's a lot of different resources. You can go to the AIC, American Institute of Conservation. They might have materials available to you on an updated basis. Also, you know, whether it's having the conservators that you work with locally establish a plan with you, even some of the appraisers and art consultants that do a lot of this type of work, and trying to really seek those people out to be a sounding board for you on a more regular basis, especially if you don't have any people that are very knowledgeable in planning for disasters that are in-house. Making sure that you've got those consultants and you're talking to them on a regular basis outside of the institution.
And I think, and I would just say, you know, get a relationship with conservators in your area, because they're going to know what's going on in your area. Because I'm new to this area, so finding conservators who understand the weather and the problems that you can encounter down here is very important.
Yeah, those personal relationships are so important. Just what you were saying, like you even said that earlier Heather, in the presentation about, getting to know your local mitigation companies and getting to know the people around you. All those things really are important. Someone also added in the chat that everyone should download the free Heritage Preservation ERS map. So that's a good, or app rather, that's a good source to do. I know that different locations also have Alliance for Response networks, AICs. I'm part of the National Heritage Responders, so they're a good resource. And AIC would be a great place to start. We have a resource page on the ARCS website, which talks about who to talk to. So those folks are out there. It's just sometimes you have to take a couple minutes just to kind of look for them, or talk to your local friendly neighborhood conservator as well. That's always a good thing, generally speaking. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and check in with Travis to see if he has anything to add to today's webinar.
I don't. I just wanted to say thank you again to all of our presenters and for everybody who attended. We hope it was a valuable session for you, and we thank you for your questions and your participation.
Indeed. Thank you to everyone. And just to remind you about those couple info dates we had earlier today, please do go ahead and register for our conference. You will also be receiving a link probably in the next hour about a survey for today's webinar. ARCS is hoping to do a few more webinars this year. So if you have ideas for content or anything else, please do let us know via that link. So I'm going to say at 1:03, we're going to go ahead and wrap up today's program. We're hoping to have this recording up in the next few days on our website by next week at the latest. Thank you again to all of our presenters, and thanks again for joining us today. Have a wonderful week.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you.